Hello, I'm coming at you from this very chilly Wednesday afternoon. This week's module, we are going to start focusing on the slave narratives. So with this introduction, I'm just going to give you, again, just a little bit of overview about what the slave narratives are, what was the purpose of the slave narratives, who were some of the most prominent African American citizens who wrote slave narratives, and just talk a little bit about what was the purpose of the narrative and what were some of the major themes of the slave narratives. So again, we'll talk about definition and purpose. We'll cover some of the major themes of the slave narratives and some of the major writers, including Frederick Douglass, whose narrative we'll be talking about in class. So first of all, the slave narratives they're a type of narrative told by either an enslaved or recently enslaved individual. These were published largely right before the Civil War. A few were published during the Civil War. Some were published just after the Civil War period. And of course, as the name implies, generally they include the experiences of African Americans who have escaped slavery. So that's an important distinction right there, because usually people did not write these narratives. They did not have the opportunity to while they were actually in bondage. So it was almost universally at some point after they were no longer slaves that they wrote their stories. And it varied from individual to individual. Some of the slaves actually penned their own narratives, as was the case with Frederick Douglass. Others who maybe did not have enough education or literacy to write their own stories, they would tell their stories to, what we would call today ghost writers, people who would still, in other words, they would dictate the story and then someone else would transcribe their story. But in some cases, they did actually write their own. So I wanted to talk just a few minutes about, this was one of my personal favorites of the slave narratives, and it was a story about a lady named Harriet Jacobs, who actually published initially under the name Linda Brent. Her story, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, it's been several years since I read it, but it was a very moving story. And the major thing that she talked about in her narrative was, she escaped from the plantation where she was enslaved, where she was living, because the owner of that plantation was forcing himself on her sexually. And it was a situation that had just become unbearable to her. So she ran away, and she ended up at a nearby home of one of her relatives, I believe, who had obtained freedom, and they were able to hide her out. She was given this little space in a cellar, or actually, I guess it was not in a cellar, it was in an attic. But she had to hide out there for several years, so that was the trade-off there. And as you can see, this illustration here shows what her living quarters were like, and she was literally confined to that very small space for, I think, at least a couple of years. She had to stay there. There was a small hole in the wall that she would use, and it, enabled her to see the outside world through that very tiny hole in this wall, not more than a crevice, really. But she did have children, and one of the things that she was able to do was she was able to view her children. Occasionally they would pass by, and that was the only way that she could see her children. So I think it was after about 36 months or something like that, she was finally able to be free of this tiny confined space. But she wrote about her experience in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which, like I said, is just one of my personal favorites of all the slave narratives. I just thought her story was very compelling. And the fact that she was female, I think, makes it interesting, because most of these narratives were written by men. But let's talk a little bit about the main purpose of the slave narrative. And, essentially, these were political documents. They were meant to aid in the attempt to abolish slavery. They attempted to arouse sympathy of readers in order to promote humanitarianism. They did emphasize traditional Christian religious ideas, appealing to the sense of right versus wrong. They showed acceptance of the ideals of dominant whites and emphasized the cruelty of slave owners. And the big thing that I really want to stress to y'all is that the slave narratives were really intended to target white audiences. Now, more specifically, they were intended to target liberal white audiences, usually in the North. They were, well, and abroad as well. But the idea was to put the story of the slaves and the plight of the slaves in front of the people that they could count on to make a stand and make a political difference. People who had some degree of power, right, and the ability to instigate change. The narratives per se were not really written for other African Americans. And I think that is an important distinction and purpose that we have to consider. They weren't written for black audiences. Because really, I mean, what would have been the point? African American people already understood how bad things were. They didn't need to be told by another slave how things were. They knew. So again, the idea was to target these narratives and to shock white readers who would then be enraged enough to do something about it. They usually do follow a very predictable structure, going from loss of innocence, which is awareness of what it means to be a slave. We definitely see that, for example, in Douglas's narrative. There has to come a moment of realization, which, of course, in turn inspires the determination to be free. The escape and freedom obtained. Typically, themes and motifs, exposure to physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. We see that quite frequently in all the narratives. We see the themes of dehumanization, the determination to acquire literacy, to read and write, because early on, slaves understood that this was the real key to freedom. Vignettes of other characters succeeding and failing, and includes the loss of family members and the destruction of family ties. Because, again, during slavery times, we know there were so many heartbreaking stories about, families separated and mothers separated from their children, And the slave narrative definitely emphasizes those themes, the very human tragedy of slavery. Again, we'll be looking at Frederick Douglass. His remains probably the most famous of all of the slave narratives. In the course of that narrative, we do see all of these bullet point themes. You know, he's going to cover his life as a slave, but also his coming into awareness, his education, ultimately his escape, and then his activism to end the institution so that other people don't have to suffer what he did. Douglass's narrative appeals to the human emotion, or we might say pathos, in his descriptive account of the slave experience. Some very brutal descriptions. You know, I almost want to say his narrative needs to come with a trigger warning because, you know, he doesn't sugarcoat anything that's happening. These narratives are valuable for capturing scenes of life on the plantation, and usually they make reference to the destruction of family ties. Education, again, a major theme of almost all of the slave narratives, particularly with Douglass's narrative, again, because he recognizes education as the key to true freedom. Eventually, most of the slave narratives recount how the person escaped the bonds of slavery. You know, and sometimes it was physical escape. Sometimes, as in the case of Elijah Equiano, he was actually able to purchase his freedom. So it was a little bit different for every slave. These are just a few more facts about Douglass's activism. I'll leave it there for just a minute or two. You can look at that. We're actually going to start with Aquiana's, just because chronologically his narrative comes first and it's a little bit shorter, so we're going to ease our way into it. But some major differences between his and Douglass's experience. He was actually captured in Africa as a small child. He made the transatlantic voyage on a slave ship. As I mentioned before, he was actually able to purchase his freedom, was able to obtain education fairly young, and then lived most of his adult life actually not in the United States, but abroad in London, where he was actually buried overseas in London. So again, his experience is quite different from some of the other slave narratives. We're going to start with, looking at the first couple of chapters of his work. We won't be able to spend as much time with that one as Douglass, but I do want you to, get some exposure to his story. All right, so that's got us through our introduction to the slave narratives, and then from here, you're going to work through some readings. There's a short video on Elijah Equiano, and then you should have an assessment quiz at the end of this module.